GoFundMe. Museum on Main Street is supported by the United States Congress. The Utah tour is receiving some very generous support from many public, private, and corporate and nonprofit sources. So we want to thank the State of Utah Legislature, the Utah Division of Arts and Museums, the Utah Division of State History, the University of Utah's American West Center. Of course, Greg Smoke is here tonight. The George S. and Dolores Story Eccles Foundation, the Lawrence T. and Janet T. D. Foundation, Dominion Energy, Rocky Mountain Power, Union Pacific, KCBW Radio, and Utah Public Radio, and of course, the National Endowment for the Humanities. None of this would be possible without the Kanab Museum and the staff there and Emily's volunteers. Emily and her volunteers have been working diligently on this project for the last year and a half. And their companion exhibit, Water Right, is fantastic. And I really encourage you to visit both exhibitions in person. So I want to shout out thanks to the City of Kanab and the Kane County for their support of the museum and for this project. It's been a really important project for everyone involved. I hope you'll enjoy Waterways and that you'll get a chance to see it in person. I hope you'll also support all the public programming that Emily has put together. It's all virtual and it's all free and it's all open to the public. So with all of that context, I'd like to introduce Greg Smoke, whose task tonight is to talk about how the larger themes represented in the Smithsonian Waterways exhibition relate to Utah. Greg is the consulting state scholar for the Utah exhibition tour and has been completely essential in helping our state team, the folks here at Utah Humanities, my team, and all of the folks around the state hosting the exhibition navigate the real complexities of Utah water. Greg directs the American West Center and is an associate professor of history at the University of Utah. His research focuses on Native and environmental history in the American West. As a publicly engaged historian, he has worked on projects for the National Park Service and the United States Forest Service, as well as numerous Native peoples. So thank you, Greg, and thank you all for coming this evening. I look forward to learning a lot.
All right, well, thank you, Megan. And I'm very happy to be here. I wish we were all together in person in Kanab. That would be preferable, certainly, but this is our reality, at least for the time being. So it's great, though, to have so many people here for this event tonight. As Megan mentioned, in my role as a state consulting scholar, it's my responsibility to help create the local state part of this story. The Waterways exhibit is put together by the Smithsonian Institution in its Museum on Main Street program. And so that same exhibit will tour in many different states, but in order to bring the local and the state story into the picture, that's where state consulting scholars like myself come in. Now, what I want to do today is not really talk about more of a general statewide Utah picture, but try to tailor my talk a little bit more towards Kanab and experiences in Kanab, and hopefully speak to the local exhibit that Emily and her crew have put together there at the Kanab Museum. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now, and hopefully this will work easily. All right, hopefully everybody can see that.
Yep.
All right, so what I'm going to talk about is Kanab and Utah's historical and cultural waterways. And I guess before I jump into this, what do we mean by waterways? I think that is really a critical question. It has double meanings here. When we talk about waterways, we can talk about natural waterways. We can talk about the natural world, but we can also talk about the ways in which human beings understand water, use water, decide who gets to use water. These are all historically and culturally derived. So waterways are both natural and cultural. They're made where the natural world intersects with human cultures. And waterways and the exhibit itself begins with this premise that water is life. And that's a pretty basic truism. No living thing on the planet can exist without water. This means that the natural world invariably shapes a people's waterways. The presence or lack of water is perhaps the most fundamental factor we face, but water also shapes landscapes. It facilitates or hinders movement. This is a photograph I took not too far from Kanab, and it actually just, truth be told, it's actually in Arizona. This is at Shongopovi, one of the towns on the Hopi Reservation, just outside of town. I was there working on another project a few years ago and passed by and had to jump out of the car and take a picture of this. So, this truism that water is life is where we begin, and that's a natural thing. But waterways are also cultural. The ways in which any society engages with the natural world reflect that society's culture, its history, its values. No two people understand their relationship to nature and to water in the same way. Moreover, the way in which single people may engage with this life-giving resource might change drastically over time, right? So we're going to historicize this as well. So let's start out talking first about the natural world. And when it comes to water, Utah is a land of extremes. Seasonal patterns and topography are primary factors that determine Utah's physical waterways. And the main point of all this is water is not evenly distributed across the state or throughout the year. And what you see here is a diagram of one of the most important physical phenomenon that impacts Utah, and that's the orographic effect. And what that means is, in Utah, most of the water we receive statewide is going to come during the winter and early spring. And that's when Pacific storms come across from the ocean and across the American West in this northwesterly flow. Whenever water in clouds rises, it falls. Precipitation is caused by this effect because as clouds that are heavily laden with water rise, they lose their ability to hold that moisture as they cool, and so it rains. And so that means that always on the west slope of mountains, you're going to find, in the American West, on the west slope, you're going to find the wettest conditions, the most vegetation. And that also means that mountains cast what is known as a rain shadow on their leeward side. And that's in the American West, that means the eastern slope. Well, the Sierra Nevada does this in a huge way. It is the major factor in creating the Great Basin, the driest region in the United States. And of course, about 1/3 of Utah is within that Great Basin province, almost 1/2 of Utah. Okay, so this is an important factor, right? So we have this extreme of wet and dry. And this has a real impact on history and on settlement. If you take a look at these two maps, right, on the left is the annual precipitation in Utah. So the darker blue, green, purple areas, the darker it gets, the more precipitation. It shouldn't surprise you that that correlates directly to mountain ranges, right? To mountain ranges, high plateaus. But when you compare that to the right-hand map, Utah's population density, you see how clearly that relationship carries over to settlement, where cities and towns have been founded, and where in the past native peoples lived in the largest numbers as well. It simply means that the life-giving resource is available there. And so you see concentrated settlement, first and foremost, obviously, in the Wasatch Oasis Zone, the area from approximately Tremont down to Payson, right, along the Wasatch Front. And that's home to over 80% of Utah's population today, right? But you also can see other areas throughout the state where that population exists. It's not going to be exact. It's not going to be exact correlation because obviously the most precipitation is right up on top of the mountains and people are not living there. But it's in those valleys that surround the mountains. Right. Okay. So nowhere is this truer than in Kanab and in southwestern Utah. This Utah is a land of extremes. This is a photograph I took out by Big Water on the Smoky Mountain Road, not too far east of where where you're all sitting this evening. And it shows, the extremes of this desert environment. Kanab gets on average just shy of 15 inches of precipitation each year, right? And so, whoops, I have these slides out of order. I'll see if I can go backwards here in a sec. Kanab gets just shy of 15 inches of precipitation each year. And while that's nearly twice as much as, say, as in St. George, it's still substantially less than the rainfall required for unirrigated agriculture. And this is an important theme, and I'm going to come back to that when we talk about John Wesley Powell. But secondly, the rains do not come evenly or at the necessary times of year, right? And if you see this climate data from Kanab, you see that 14.94 inches of rain per year, but you can see that the driest season in Kanab is the spring, or the late spring, excuse me, April, May, June. The wettest time is early, late winter, or winter and late fall. The anomaly, of course, is late summer, and that's a different critter altogether. That's the summer monsoon. And so while there is rainfall coming, it comes in deluges, right? You see very localized, severe thunderstorms at times that cause flash floods. And as you all know, they can turn dry washes into death traps in a matter of minutes. So this is not a land that sees extended, gentle rainfall. This is not a land that is going to be easy to grow crops, right? And so this extreme environment poses real obstacles for any human inhabitants. And I don't think I can back up the slides the way things are set up right now, but the photo before was of Marble Canyon, again, not too far from Kanab, over on the Colorado River by Lee's Ferry. The point I was going to make with that slide was that this land of extremes idea also extends to the way in which water has carved our landscape and has really become more of throughout much of Utah, more of an obstacle to movement than an asset. Throughout much of the United States, rivers, big rivers, the Columbia, the Mississippi, the Ohio, the Missouri, they serve as avenues of commerce and travel. But in Utah, because of the aridity and because of the extreme nature of the rainfall and the landscape itself, rivers most often run at the bottom of sometimes very inaccessible narrow canyons, and they've had to be overcome rather than being used for wide-scale commerce or travel. All right. I should have advanced that. This is a slide that shows you the operation of the summer monsoon, right? That the moist air coming off the Gulf of Mexico gets pulled up through the American Southwest, through New Mexico and Arizona, and then as it rises, the same phenomenon, that orographic effect, as it rises over the Colorado Plateau, it lets loose with these very severe thunderstorms. Okay, so if Utah's a land of extremes, that's not the only factor in understanding Utah's waterways. Culture is also critical. Waterways are also always cultural, right? An extreme environment poses obstacles. It presents some opportunities, yet it alone never determines human responses. Different cultures with different values and goals will approach the same environment in distinctly different ways. And so that's what I want to talk about now, is turn towards the cultural. And first talk a little bit about native waterways before we move on to Euro-American traditions and legalities, right? As I approach these two, though, native waterways and Euro-American waterways, what I want to call your attention to is a central difference that comes down to adjustment and adaptation. More precisely, we should look at who or what was expected to adapt or to change. For the native peoples of Utah, their approach to waterways can best be generalized as one as adaptation to the environment, to the natural world. This was not true of all Native people in North America. The Hohokam culture in Arizona in 1,000 years ago created large-scale irrigation works, but generally we didn't see that in Utah or in many other places in North America. Instead, understanding the natural limitations of the environment, Namik peoples, these are Paiutes, Utes, Shoshones, and Dene peoples, the Navajo, learned how to maximize the resources they had. So they didn't attempt to change the natural world too much, right? You see on the right an ancestral Puebloan, sometimes called Anasazi, irrigation ditch that was excavated during the Glen Canyon excavations that took place just before the canyon was flooded by Glen Canyon Dam in the early 1960s. So the central difference, what changes? Native peoples are not going to try to change the environment, but to find ways to interact and adapt to it. And this is very much evident in Paiute waterways, in the ways in which Paiute people engaged with the natural world. Paiute people in Southwest Utah planted small gardens, and they planted these along stream beds in the best watered areas. Rivers like the Virgin, the Santa Clara, the Muddy down in Nevada. Paiute women conducted most of the agriculture. They planted gardens of corn, squash, gourds, and beans. They even transplanted some wild plant species such as sunflowers and amaranth. They used digging sticks to carve out short channels from the river to the gardens. And these gardens, again, fairly small scale. And in 1776, near modern Tokerville, Utah, the members of the Dominguez-Escalante expedition rejoiced when they found a store of harvested corn. And nearby, they recorded, quote, "On the brief bottoms and bank of the river, there were 3 small maize fields with their well-dug irrigation ditches." Unquote. And so this, illustrates, again, the small scale, but the fact that the fields themselves were in the river bottom. This is not moving water vast distances, but actually using nature to try to bring water to the crops. And this is very similar to what Fremont and ancestral Puebloan people had done for centuries and centuries before this, right? Now, in general, though, most Paiute groups, even those who planted gardens, spent the major portion of each year traveling through their traditional ranges, collecting wild plant foods. And these consisted of grass seeds, pinon nuts, those are the 2 most important, and hunting for game. Now, during these rounds, knowing where water was essential, right? It was of the utmost importance. Water flowed to the surface at the larger springs, but in many other places, Paiute families had to dig down into the earth and wait for water to fill in that hole, that depression that they had dug in this seeping way. Now, Paiute people, because of their traditions of land use, pre-contact Paiutes did not have a legal tradition of apportioning or owning water rights like Euro-Americans might. This doesn't mean that Paiute people did not look at territory as not being their own or of a particular group. Like Shoshone and Ute peoples, Paiute bands recognized a homeland in which they moved through. And they would negotiate with other bands for access to resources in other places if grass seeds or pine nuts were more plentiful in another place. But this didn't translate, this type of ownership, this type of homeland did not translate into a codified water right or a legal water right. And this put Native people at a severe disadvantage when Euro-American settlers arrived on the scene. Okay, so again, cultural difference here. Mostly Native peoples are adapting to the environment, living within those limitations, finding ways to use nature for their advantage without having to really transform nature. Euro-Americans are going to approach things in a very different way. And these are culturally and historically derived ideas. Now, what's interesting in Utah is that you have a distinct culture within a culture. You have a Euro-American base, but you also have an LDS or Mormon culture. And although their motivations might differ, both Mormon and non-Mormon Euro-Americans approach building Utah waterways in very similar ways, very, very similar manner. For them, it would not be a matter of adapting to nature, but a matter of changing nature, of bending it to fit. Bending it, they hoped or thought, to achieve a desired outcome. Euro-Americans wanted, for economic, political, and religious reasons, to transplant and sustain an agrarian way of life that had grown up in the humid East. This meant adapting to the arid West only as far as necessary, and all the while looking for ways to transform that environment in an attempt to overcome its limitations. And this also meant building traditions to claim ownership over water rights, right? So property, again, what this is going to come down to, I'll give you a brief spoiler here. It comes down to wanting to recreate agricultural settlements, farms, private property. Private property without water in the West is worthless property, at least for agriculture, right? So that means, what do we want to talk about next? Well, let's talk about water rights themselves and water law in the United States more generally, okay? Now, in the broadest terms, there are two great traditions of water law in the United States. One is called riparian doctrine. The other is called prior appropriation, right? Under riparian doctrine, water rights are tied to land ownership. Anyone owning riparian lands, that is land along a stream, a river, a stream, or a lake, has the right to reasonably use those waters, provided they do not diminish the resource for others. Okay, now riparian doctrine originated in British common law, and it worked well in the humid East, where, like the British Isles, there was ample rainfall. It meant farmers did not need to divert water to their fields. And here, if you look at this map, you can see where riparian doctrine remains the law of the land in the United States. Right, so you can see very clearly in the East, right? So someone living along a stream simply used that water for home consumption. They used it to power mill wheels. The water continued to flow downstream. That was fine. Now, in the West, however, very different system comes about, and that's called prior appropriation. It emerged first in the California gold fields, and this doctrine was a reflection of both the West's aridity and developing capitalist economy in 19th century America. Prior appropriation rests on two principles: first in time, first in right, and beneficial use. Now, to begin with, how is it different from riparian doctrine? Well, first of all, it separates water rights from property ownership. Just because you own a piece of land along a stream does not mean you have a right to use the water in that stream. How do you get that right? Well, you file a claim on that water right. Obtaining a right requires filing a claim with the state water engineer or another official and establishing that right and a priority date. The priority date is the date that is registered with the engineer. People who file on that same stream for a portion of that stream later, their right is junior to yours. Right? So if you file first, you have the first right, right? Those with the earlier date possess the senior superior right. That means that in a dry time, a senior water user downstream, as you can see in this little diagram on the left here, has perhaps the right to their full allotment of water, even if it means a junior water user upstream, farther upstream, who could take the water out first, has to let all that water go by. Right? But beneficial use is also part of this. There's the doctrine of prior appropriation rests on requirements of action. This is under this law, water is still essentially a community resource. It's not private property per se. It's the right that you have, that you own. And so that means you have to put it to use. And so consequently, right holders, whether they be individuals, corporations, municipalities, must prove up their claim by putting the water to a beneficial use. And this could include a lot of different things: household, municipal use, industrial consumption, stock watering, working a mining claim. That's certainly where it started in California, or irrigating crops. Failure to do so means that they could lose that water right. Okay, so these are the two broad applications of water law in the United States. I'm leaving out a third one because this isn't a class in water law, but there are also federally reserved water rights, but that would complicate the picture here. But let's say, we've got these doctrines, but the application of any legal doctrine has always been embedded in the unique social and political history of a place. For the Mormons, religious ideals led to specific settlement patterns, and it also led them to delay the implementation of prior appropriation until the period at the very end of the 19th century. Right? At a time when many Euro-Americans were embracing capitalism and seeking a new life on isolated homesteads, LDS settlers were attempting to recreate the communitarian values they saw in the compact settlements of early New England towns. And that shouldn't come as a surprise, because many of the early leaders of the Mormon Church were New Englanders. Their families, at least, were New England families. Right? And so what did they want? Well, they wanted this compact settlement. They wanted to recreate the New England town in a sense. And this was because this is a religious ideal. Rather than adopting this homestead model that was very popular in the United States, and we'll get back to that in a moment, they wanted to live in close proximity in communities surrounded by farmlands or pastures. And what this meant was that in arid Utah, you see the creation of what geographers call the Mormon cultural landscape. And this is an idealized type of settlement pattern that you don't see everywhere in the American West. Small towns with people living in close proximity, irrigation ditches, small and large, are part of that landscape. The poplar trees lining the streets, unpainted wood fences. There are all these different elements that come together in the Mormon cultural landscape. And some of the farming towns, say up in the Sanpete Valley, are kind of still, like Spring City, are a great place to see how this really looks. Some of it still survives today, right? So there's this religious motivation to create a community. Now, there's also political and economic motivations, right? And water and autonomy go hand in hand in early Utah. Brigham Young, who led the LDS Church West to escape violence in the East, the violence that had followed the church in the East in Missouri and Illinois, he was seeking to build the Mormon state of Deseret as far from the Americans as possible. Part of this plan was to create self-sustaining communities with minimal dependence on outsiders or on outside imports. And in an arid place like Utah, control over water was part of these plans. Right? So from the very beginning, water was deemed a communal resource, not private property. In the early years, local water, the distribution of water rights was handled mostly by local bishops and then county commissioners. The county commissions at the time were called courts, but they really acted more like a commission. They distributed rights to the faithful on the basis of need and on perceived worthiness. And territorial laws were also passed that were aimed at preserving local control. And that means Mormon control over the water. A good example of this was an 1865 law that allowed residents to organize self-governing irrigation districts. It also served to sustain local control. Under this law, irrigation districts could not issue bonds or assume debts. They could only be financed by taxes levied on the local community that benefited directly from the waterworks. Now, obvious disadvantage of this law is that it cuts off the possibility of outside investment. But what it did also was prevent outsiders from gaining a vested right or interest in precious water resources. Now, over time, however, the powerful appeal of Gilded Age individual capitalism grew in formerly communitarian Utah. By the 1880s, after Brigham Young's death, the legislature began to repeal earlier laws and move towards the implementation of prior appropriation. Right? So what does all this mean? Well, it means that Mormon settlement in Utah was guided by the desire to establish a communitarian agrarian society that most had known in the humid East. This meant the control of water. This meant building waterworks, building irrigation ditches, transforming the land. Right? Now, other Euro-Americans had the same goal, but not for the same reasons. Other Euro-Americans also sought to transplant that life and society they knew in the East to the arid West, but for other cultural and social imperatives. And this is what brings us to John Wesley Powell, the famous one-armed Union Army veteran and famed government explorer and scientist. Powell grew up in Illinois, and he grew up in a time and an era where freeholding yeoman farmers were revered as the cornerstone of the American Republic. And that is the system that he wanted to see spread across the arid West. This idea that stems from this Jeffersonian vision of utopian capitalism was one of the motivating factors for his service in the Civil War. He was driven by this powerful vision of an American economic democracy. Right? And so sustaining that way of life meant survival for the nation. Before the Civil War, the expansion of slavery posed the greatest threat to free labor and free men in those years. But with the slave power vanquished in the Civil War, white Americans were again moving west. They seemed to face a new problem, a new enemy, and that was the environment itself. West of the 100th meridian, this is where we get back to that how much rainfall falls in a year. West of the 100th meridian, less than 20 inches of rainfall on average falls. And what that means is that non-irrigated agriculture can be precarious or impossible. If you got less than 20 inches of rainfall, but it all fell in the summer, you'd be great, you'd be fine. However, that's not the way it works, as we've explained in the American West, with the physical West, right? That most of the rainfall comes in the winter and early spring in a place like Utah. The summer is a dry time and you could just sit there and watch your crops burn up in the field. So how do you transplant this agrarian democracy raised up in damp eastern soils to the arid lands of the West? That's a great question that Powell wanted to answer. And that's what brought him to Kanab. That's what brought him to the American West. He's, of course, most famous for his 1869 expedition on the Green and Colorado Rivers, the first to descend the Grand Canyon. But 2 years later, he returned for a second, better supported and more methodical survey of the Colorado Plateau. And that's where you see the photograph in the center of this slide. The first Powell expedition in 1869, no one brought any cameras, equipment, so there are no photographs of the first expedition. So any photos you see of Powell on the Colorado or Green River all come from the second expedition. Powell was also deeply interested in native peoples, and for a time would direct both the U.S. Geological Survey and the Bureau of American Ethnology. And so while studying the landscape, he also studied and interacted with native peoples, including the Paiute people around Kanab. Now, during the second survey, I should put this here, during the second survey, Powell made his base camp in Kanab. After descending the Green River through the Canyon of Lador, Desolation Canyon, and the Colorado River, through Cataract Canyon, and into Glen Canyon. He then made base camp 1871 to 1873 in Kanab, or just south, originally just south of Kanab, just over the Arizona line, and then later moved the base camp to Kanab itself in subsequent years. It's in this base camp that Powell first drew maps of the Colorado River. In fact, Powell's relationship to Kanab goes back even before that expedition, even before that time he spent, that focus time he spent in Kanab. In the fall of 1870, he came to Utah to plan this expedition and to lay the groundwork for the expedition and to do some preliminary reconnaissance. And he ended up coming to Kanab, and he was actually recruited by Jacob Hamlin to help him try to solve the ongoing conflict between Navajo people and Mormon settlers in southern Utah and the Arizona Strip. That's another story that would take a while to explain, but is an interesting sidelight here. What's most important, though, for our purpose here, to get back to this main story of cultural waterways and how water was, how we approached the use of water, was that it was in Kanab and in Utah that Powell really started to think deeply about how can you transplant that agrarian society to Utah. He does not share the religious motivation of Mormon settlers, but he does look at them as a possible example. They want the same, they have the same goal to create an agrarian society. They may have different motivations for that, but what Powell sees is a small scale, community-based set of waterworks that are locally controlled. He sees this as being of exceptional importance, right? So the Mormon settlements of Utah and in places like Kanab serve as an example for him to draw upon as he comes up with what the famous Western writer and historian Wallace Stegner called Powell's blueprint for a dryland democracy. Okay, and that's what brings us to this map. And this is a map that is used in many, you'll see this in the Waterways publication, you'll see it in some of the exhibits. The famous map, and this came from Powell's very important report on the lands of the arid region of the United States, first published in 1878. And what you're seeing here are drainage districts, major watersheds in the American West. Now, a watershed is a natural system. All of the waters that are collected within that system flow to a low point, right? Mostly they flow to the sea through rivers. In the case of the Great Basin, though, where we have endoheic or closed systems, they end in saline lakes or in lake beds, playas, and so on, right? So this is what the West looks like. It's a very different look for the American West than, say, the big square states that we are used to. So he begins in the report on the arid regions to think about how to manage or how to make possible this expansion into the American West. Now, the first thing he argued, and the first thing he wanted Americans to understand about the American West is that it was a dry place, and that we had to actually come to grips with its aridity and with the actual limitations on settlement in the West. This was not something that 19th century or 21st century Americans are really fond of hearing. Right? Now, he believed that there were about he believed that about 3% of the irrigable land in the West could actually be watered. You actually could put water on that land. That's what you could do. Now, today in Utah, there's 1.2 million acres of land under irrigation. That's roughly 2% of Utah's land area. So he's not far off. He actually overestimated in that sense. Powell was not a modern environmentalist. He is better understood as a forerunner of progressive era conservation. He believed that resources should be used for human development. And in this way, he's like many of his contemporaries. The difference was, and this is critical, this gets back to this know the limitations part of it. The difference was that he was a scientist and he understood the severe limitation that the natural environment in the West posed. So irrigating the West was going to take rational planning and careful stewardship and technology, but it also had to be done within accepted limits. Right? So bringing, he said, perhaps 100 million acres under irrigation to provide homesteads for over 1 million American families would demand concerted planning, an enormous amount of money, and cooperative labor. It would also require making intensive use of every drop of the region's scant water. That the West's rivers should be used was something he did not question. He wrote in an 1890 article in Century Magazine, quote, "Conquered rivers are better servants than wild clouds." But technology was not the whole answer for Powell. I need to emphasize that again. Technological mastery was part of the answer, but not the whole answer. The heart of Powell's proposal that he would eventually announce in these articles and in these reports entailed redrawing the arid West's political boundaries to align with its natural watersheds, what you're seeing on the screen right now. Existing state, county, and township boundaries were drawn along the straight lines of an imaginary survey grid. Right? That survey grid goes back to the Land Ordinance of 1785, and 2/3 of the United States has been surveyed on that grid pattern. Right? But the grid artificially divides watersheds, and it makes conflicts over water rights inevitable. So what Powell argued instead was to use nature's divisions of the water, dictate human social and political geography by following the watersheds, and in that way determine water rights. In the American West, that would mean that a handful of big squarish states would effectively be replaced by a couple of hundred or more watershed units. And Powell called these natural districts. And you see the larger watersheds on this map, not all of the several hundred natural districts would be here on this map itself. Now, how might this have worked in practice? Well, we go back to water rights. Water rights would again be attached to land ownership, but not exactly like riparian doctrine. The quality and location of the land would be central considerations. Remember, in riparian doctrine, if you owned land along a river, you could always use that water regardless. That's not the way Powell saw it, right? You had to own land that was near a stream, right, to have access to that water, but the quality and the location of the land would be central considerations. Powell divided watersheds into 3 types of districts, with settlement patterns determined by a rational assessment of each district's potential. The headwaters districts he called first-class districts, and they stretched from the mountains to the fertile valleys immediately below. These were the most desirable and promising districts for irrigation, and the people who lived in those districts could keep all of the water that might be used. So you follow what I'm getting at here, right? That Powell said, this is the area that's most logically irrigated. Right? Now, to preserve a democratic society of freeholders and to keep out monopoly interests, remember that's also Powell's goal, ownership of irrigable lands in the watershed district would be limited to a single 80-acre tract, and all reservoir and canal sites would be kept as district property. With the exception of mines and town sites, all non-irrigable lands within the first-class districts, these would essentially be the mountainous timberlands, would also be closed to development. And again, they would remain under federal ownership in perpetuity and manage to preserve the health of the watershed. Right? And control over these, though, would also be vested in the people of the district. So that's the first-class districts. Those are the ones up high that are the best potential irrigable lands. Below the headwaters lay the second-class or river trunk districts. Here, the residents could build reservoirs on tributary streams to collect local waters, or they could build reservoirs on the main stem to capture waters that might flow down from above. But in recognition of the land's more limited potential, their water rights would always be inferior to those upstream. Regardless of when they filed the claim, they would still be inferior to those upstream. And there were third-class districts. These are the sad lost stream districts, according to Powell. They would possess only the rights to meager water, the meager waters that might be trapped within their boundaries. And they would have a widely scattered and scanty population. Okay, so how did this work out? Well, the first step was going to be an irrigation survey of the American West, a comprehensive survey of the region. And initially with support of powerful Western politicians like Nevada's Senator William Stewart. Stewart hoped that the project would actually facilitate rapid and unfettered development in the West. Congress funded the irrigation survey in 1888, and Powell got to work. All right, so then how did this plan actually work? We don't know. It never was allowed to, Powell was never allowed to follow through with this. His concept of autonomous watershed commonwealths did not sit well with the boosters, with the railroads, cattle barons, and timber companies, or the politicians, most notably Stewart himself, who looked after those interests. They had a very different vision of a capitalist development in the West, and it would not be driven by Jeffersonian yeoman farmers. So after only 2 years, with the work barely underway, Congress cut appropriations for the irrigation survey, and the operation shut down. And, to be honest, most average Westerners did not support Powell's plan. They did not want to accept the fact that only a tiny fraction of the region could successfully be reclaimed, be irrigated. They preferred to embrace promises of unbounded expansion and prosperity. And such boosterism and unrealistic expectations were on full display when the Second International Irrigation Congress met in Los Angeles in 1893. An increasingly demoralized Powell was also in attendance. The delegates had a platform that called for government intervention to provide irrigated farm for millions of landless Americans. Powell took to the stage and essentially threw a bucket of cold water on their fervor. He told them that no matter if they used every river, creek, brook, spring, or well, there simply was not enough water to fulfill this grand vision in the American West. Gentlemen, he concluded, you are piling up a heritage of conflict and litigation over water rights, for there is not sufficient water to supply these lands. Unquote. And the response was immediate. He was shouted down from the stage, and it would be the last time he spoke publicly on water and irrigation in the West. The following year, he resigned his post as the director of the U.S. Geological Survey. But if his plan had been firmly rejected, his warning for the future proved prescient. As the American West entered the 20th century, the conquest over water rights only grew deeper as Western states fought for their share of the region's most precious resource. It certainly was on full display, of course, with the Colorado Compact of 1922. And you see in this slide, the commission that reached that compact between the states that share the Colorado River. And on the right, you see Glen Canyon Dam, the subject of great controversy historically and today over the transfer of water. And so we don't know how Powell's plan would have worked out. We do know that his prediction of conflict, of litigation, driven by this need to sustain a way of life in an environment that or not accept the limitations that environment imposed, has been a major factor in creating this type of conflict that we still see in Utah and the American West today. So I'm going to stop sharing there. That could be another long lecture right there. So I'm going to stop there and stay focused, leave us very focused on Kanab and on Powell. and be happy to answer questions.
Yeah, Greg, thanks so much. So yeah, if anybody has any questions, we do just have a few minutes left for that. I feel like this far into 2020, a lot of us have been using Zoom for work and other things. So we know already how to raise our hand using the blue hand in the participants box. So if anybody has any questions or comments, you can go ahead and do that now.
Doesn't it have a thing right there you can ask a question?
Anybody out there got a question? I see some people are unmuted. I don't know if that was intentional or not.
Well, that's you. Just ask.
Wow, Greg, you must have
Hello.
covered it. Oh,
I'm trying to figure out how to raise my hand.
all right. Is this Joe Stewart?
Yeah, this is actually her husband.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, go ahead.
So I wanted to go back to the map that he showed about the hydrologic boundaries that Powell looked at, because it's, as somebody who's traveled around the West, it becomes really obvious that he's right. That the cultural boundaries are really confined by these hydrologic flows, the rivers, the drainages. And I'm wondering if there is any continuing pressure to try to adjust to those boundaries.
Wow. I honestly, that would be such a fundamental earth-shaking change to change state boundaries today. The only places that I know that states have ever shifted their boundaries are in places like the Missouri River, where the river shifts its flow and a chunk of land goes from Iowa to Nebraska, and that kind of thing has occurred once or twice. But in the American West, the issue is that using that grid, we have laid out these massive states with straight line borders. And once that process was completed in the 19th century, and that process was often highly conflicted, deeply political, I don't know that there is a political will, at least not right now, to make any change like that. It would fundamentally change the nature of government as well. It would restructure how, what states look like. It would certainly restructure how they voted. It could change the entire politics of the American West. Remember, that was the important thing Powell wanted. It wasn't just about nature. It wasn't just about, okay, here's a watershed and the people who live in that watershed should control that water. He deeply wanted the people who lived in that watershed to control that water. That was going to be theirs. They were going to be self-governing. For him, this is what continued that American experiment in democracy, right? And this is what the yeoman farmer was all about in his vision as utopian capitalism. So, I mean, it would fundamentally change the American West. And it would be, I don't see any political will for this happening today. I mean, people will argue that that's the way things should be.
So I will close with a comment that if you look at the native populations of the West, that the native tribal homelands reflect those ecological boundaries a different version, but fairly similar. And that, but if you look at a lot of the geopolitical conflicts that we deal with in the world, for specifically, say, the Middle East, it's exactly the same problem. There's these arbitrary boundaries that have nothing to do with the ecological or the tribal or the historical way that people migrated. And so there's just war that will go on forever. Thanks.
Well, I would say that in some cases, native homelands do. In other cases, native homelands have been sliced and diced and covered by these artificial boundaries as well. I mean, the best example are the Blackfeet people. 2/3 of the Blackfeet Nation lives in Alberta, Canada. 1/3 live in the United States. So an international boundary went right through their territory. And they recognize that, and today there is a solution to that. There's a border crossing that can only be used by Blackfeet people crossing back and forth between the United States and Canada. but they have to be Blackfeet enrolled members of the Blackfeet Nation. So in some case, but yeah, I mean, Native people would ideally live in those places, but we also see a great deal of Indian removal. You know, one of the things I deal with in the essay is the removal of Ute people from central Utah, from, you know, one of the greatest fisheries that existed in the American West was on Provo River at the mouth, the Provo River on Utah Lake. And I know people drive past that today and they look at it and go, oh, look at that, there's all that algae out there. It's this urban area, there's the Geneva steel was there, and they can't envision what a luxuriant ecosystem that was with multiple types of fish. Ute people were by 1865 forced out of Utah Valley to the Uinta Basin. And so, you know, in some cases, Native people have been able to sustain that and are in those homelands. In other cases, they have been forced out, and those straight line boundaries have been drawn right across them.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent. Do we have any other questions? I thought I saw a few hands there. All right, I see the Angulos.
I don't really have a question. I was just going to say thank you so much, because it was so interesting. Just even learning about water rights and the way that the different part of the United States are separated and how they do that. And then also just a little bit more history about Powell and his vision and what he was thinking. Very, very interesting. So thank you so much for a wonderful presentation.
Yeah, you're very welcome. And I think that Powell is often misconstrued and misunderstood. People don't understand really the breadth of his work. Often have, you know, I myself am a river runner. I've done many of the rivers, all the rivers in Utah and in many other states. And he's kind of looked at as a patron saint or a godfather of river running. But he was really, you know, going down the river for John Wesley Powell was a utilitarian thing. It was a way for him to survey some of the most rugged, unmapped country remaining in North America. And we know how hard it is to move through the Canyonlands. And, you know, it damn near killed him and his crew a couple of times, or more than a couple of times. You know, and it also points to the fact that those rivers are not great for commerce or transportation either. It takes some adventure spirit and some risk to get down them.
All right, so that looks like that's just about it for our time. So I want to thank everybody again for attending our program this evening. Also want to invite everybody to come visit us at the Kanab Museum while we're displaying our Waterways and Water Right exhibit. So they'll be showing here at the Kanab Museum from today all the way up until December 13th. So if you have time in your schedule, please feel free to stop by and see what we have to offer. And then also in closing, again, I would just love to thank Greg so much for his time with us this evening and his words. And also I want to thank Megan from Utah Humanities for giving us her opening comments this evening. So that's all I have for you. And I hope everybody has a wonderful night. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Greg. Thank you, Megan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Megan.
So interesting.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Looking
Thank
forward to
you.
the next one.
It was, one of the coolest records, they put a rack in these